All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today we're tackling something that might sound a little dry at first, but trust me, it's anything but. We're talking about Sweden's electric grid and what happens when they really start cranking up the wind and solar power.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating situation. I mean, Sweden's already got a pretty impressive renewable energy portfolio, right?
They do. In 2022, what was it? Hydropower was leading the charge at 41%.
That's right. And then nuclear power came in at 29%. Wind was already up to 19%, pretty respectable. And then you had biofuels making up about 9%.
So not exactly starting from zero. But what we're really digging into here is what happens when wind and solar start to push past that 30% mark of total energy production. Because some of our sources suggest that could be a real tipping point, like things could get interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Up until that point, integrating more renewables is pretty manageable. But once you go beyond that, there are certain complexities that start to emerge. And a lot of those revolve around this idea of grid stability.
Okay, so let's talk grid stability. Our sources kept mentioning three main concerns: voltage stability, frequency stability, and this thing called transient stability. Could you break those down for us in, relatively simple terms?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. So, starting with voltage stability, think of it like water pressure in a pipe. The grid needs to maintain a pretty consistent voltage level to function properly.
Makes sense so far?
And wind and solar power, because they're variable sources, they depend on the wind blowing and the sun shining, they can cause some fluctuations in that voltage.
So too much power surging in at once could create problems, kind of like a sudden spike in water pressure.
Exactly. But here's the cool part. Modern wind turbines and solar panels are actually designed with something called reactive power management. Basically, it's a built-in system that helps to smooth out those voltage swings. Kind of acts like a pressure regulator for the grid.
So the technology itself is getting smarter about how it interacts with the grid. That's good news. What about frequency stability? Our sources made it sound like that's kind of the heartbeat of the whole system.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. For a grid to operate properly, it needs to maintain a very steady frequency in Europe, that's 50 hertz. And traditionally, that's been maintained by the big spinning turbines in those traditional power plants, especially hydro and nuclear. They provide a lot of what's called inertia.
Okay, so it's like a giant flywheel effect. Those massive turbines resist changes in speed and keep everything humming along at that steady 50 hertz.
Right, but wind and solar, because their output fluctuates, they don't have that same inherent inertia. So as their share of the grid grows, it becomes more challenging to maintain that critical frequency stability.
Got it. So that's voltage and frequency. Now, what about this third one, transient stability? What is that exactly?
Okay, imagine the grid has to deal with a sudden shock or disturbance, right? Like a lightning strike, a piece of equipment failing, or a sudden change in power flow. And traditional power plants, with that inertia we talked about, they can help buffer those events. But with more variable sources like wind and solar, we need more sophisticated grid management systems to step in and make sure things stay stable.
So it's not just how much wind and solar we add to the grid, it's about how the entire system adapts to these new players. And that brings us to another layer of this whole situation, the impact this has on those existing power plants. Like, Sweden really relies on its hydropower for flexibility, but constantly adjusting the output of those plants to compensate for fluctuations in wind and solar, that can't be good for them in the long run, right?
Yeah, you're hitting on a really important point. It's like asking a marathon runner to constantly sprint. They can do it for a while, but there's a price to pay. And with hydropower, that price might come in the form of increased wear and tear, more maintenance, and potentially a shorter lifespan for those plants.
So there could be some hidden costs to going green, at least in the short term. And then you've got nuclear power, which isn't exactly known for being nimble and adaptable. Can those plants really keep up with the constant ups and downs of wind and solar?
That's a big question mark. Nuclear plants are designed for steady, continuous operation. They like to hum along at a consistent output. Forcing them to ramp up and down quickly to accommodate the variability of wind and solar creates all sorts of technical and economic challenges.
So maybe nuclear isn't the ideal dance partner in this rapidly evolving energy landscape. What about biogas? Our sources mention that it plays a role in Sweden's energy mix, but it also seems to be pretty sensitive to shifts in the market. How does that fit into all of this?
Biogas is interesting because it does offer some flexibility. It can be ramped up and down more easily than nuclear, but it's very sensitive to fluctuations in the price of electricity. So if wind and solar are pushing prices down during periods of high production, it can make it harder for biogas plants to compete economically.
So you could have a situation where increasing one type of renewable energy actually hinders the viability of another type of renewable energy. That's not ideal.
It just shows how complex this transition really is. It's not as simple as just adding more wind and solar to the grid. It's about creating a whole system that can accommodate all these different energy sources and ensure that everything remains stable for the long haul.
Well, we've definitely laid out some of the potential pitfalls here, but I know Sweden is also exploring a range of solutions to address these challenges. Let's dig into that toolbox, so to speak, in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, for sure. It's not all doom and gloom, right? Sweden's not just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. They're actually looking into a bunch of different solutions, and that's where things start to get pretty exciting.
Okay, so lay it on us. What's in this energy toolbox?
Well, first off, we've got grid modernization. And I'm not just talking about putting up some stronger power lines. This is about making the grid itself smarter, using data and some really advanced technology to create a more responsive, more efficient system.
So like giving the grid a brain upgrade.
Exactly. Think of a grid that can actually anticipate when there are going to be fluctuations in wind and solar power and then adjust in real time to keep everything running smoothly. That's the whole idea behind grid modernization.
Okay, that sounds pretty promising. What else?
Another big one, energy storage. Imagine these massive batteries that can just soak up all that excess solar and wind energy when production is high, and then release it back into the grid when demand goes up.
It's like a giant energy savings account for the entire grid.
Ah, I like that. And that's exactly what it is. These storage solutions are crucial for smoothing out the variability of renewables and making sure there's always a consistent energy supply no matter what.
I'm sold. But I bet those giant batteries don't come cheap.
True, it's a significant investment, no doubt, but the technology is developing so rapidly, and the costs are already starting to come down. Plus, I mean, you have to consider the cost of doing nothing about climate change. That's going to be way more expensive in the long run.
Right, that's a good point. Our sources also mentioned something called demand-side management, and I have to admit, I'm not quite sure what that is. Can you enlighten me?
It's all about getting consumers involved in the energy equation. Think about it. Smart appliances that can automatically adjust their energy use depending on what's happening on the grid at any given moment. Or even something like time-of-day pricing, where you might pay a little less for electricity during times when renewable energy production is high.
So it's not just about building bigger and better power plants. It's about making the entire energy system more flexible and responsive. That's kind of cool, actually.
I know, right? And it means that everyone has a role to play. Everyone can contribute to making the grid work better.
Speaking of contributing, we've talked a lot about the impact of all this on renewables, but can those existing power plants actually be part of the solution too? Like the hydro and the nuclear plants we were talking about earlier.
Good question. And yes, they absolutely can. And that's where this idea of flexible generation comes in. Basically, we can upgrade existing power plants, even some nuclear plants, to make them more adaptable, more responsive to fluctuations in the grid.
So we're giving those steady ships some fancy new steering mechanisms. Okay, I like where this is going. But before we get too optimistic, our sources did keep mentioning the Swedish term svangmassa, and I have to admit, I'm completely lost on that one.
Yeah, svangmassa. It basically translates to rotational inertia. Think of it like this: it's the resistance of a spinning object to changes in speed. So in the context of a power grid, most of that svangmassa is coming from those big, heavy turbines in traditional power plants.
Right, that flywheel effect we were talking about earlier. But as we add more wind and solar, which don't have those giant spinning turbines, we're losing some of that svangmassa, right?
Exactly. And that's the problem, because svangmassa is really important for keeping that grid frequency stable. When there's a sudden change in supply or demand, the inertia from those spinning turbines helps prevent drastic swings in frequency.
So how do we make up for that loss of svangmassa as we bring more and more wind and solar into the system?
Well, there are a few different options on the table. One is to invest in technologies that can actually provide synthetic inertia. These are systems that are designed to mimic the behavior of traditional power plants by responding really quickly to any changes in grid frequency.
Wait, so we can create virtual spinning turbines?
Well, not exactly, but kind of. There are various technologies out there, like advanced battery storage systems and even some specially designed wind turbines that can essentially step in and provide that synthetic inertia that the grid needs.
Wow. It really sounds like Sweden's got a pretty solid plan for tackling this whole energy transition.
They're definitely on the right track. But it's important to remember that this is an ongoing process, right? The world of energy is constantly changing and evolving, and there are always new technologies and solutions emerging.
So basically, we need to stay flexible and adaptable, just like the grid itself. That makes sense. But it also sounds like a pretty daunting task.
It's definitely challenging, there's no doubt about that, but it's also incredibly exciting. Think about it, we're talking about fundamentally changing the way we produce and consume energy. And that's going to have a huge impact, not just on the environment, but on our economies and societies as well.
I hadn't thought about it like that before, but you're right. This is a pretty monumental shift we're talking about. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they process all of this information?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no single magic bullet, right? It's going to take a whole range of solutions to get this right, from grid upgrades to energy storage to getting consumers involved. And we need to keep investing in research and development to push the boundaries of what's possible.
And probably just stay informed and engaged in the conversation as well, because this is something that affects all of us, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, this is about creating a future where everyone has access to clean, reliable, and affordable energy. And that's a future worth working towards, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. But before we get too carried away with all the positive vibes, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Our sources kept mentioning the potential impact of all this on Sweden's biogas industry, and I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. Biogas is a really valuable part of Sweden's renewable energy mix. It's sustainable, it's flexible, and it can definitely play a big role in the energy transition. But like we talked about earlier, it's very sensitive to fluctuations in the market.
So if wind and solar are driving down electricity prices when production is high, that could make it really tough for biogas plants to compete.
Exactly. And that's something we need to be careful about. We don't want to end up undermining one form of renewable energy while we're trying to promote another.
Right. So how do we protect the biogas industry as Sweden ramps up its wind and solar capacity?
There are a few things we can do. One option is to implement policies that provide some price stability for biogas. Things like feed-in tariffs or carbon pricing mechanisms.
So basically guaranteeing a certain price for the biogas they produce,
Yeah.
regardless of what's happening in the broader electricity market.
Exactly. That would give biogas producers more certainty and encourage them to keep investing in the sector.
Makes sense. And what about grid modernization? Would that help too?
Definitely. A smarter, more flexible grid would be better able to accommodate the variable output of all these different energy sources, including wind, solar, and biogas. And that would reduce the risk of those price swings that could hurt the biogas industry.
So it really comes back to creating a more balanced and integrated energy system, right? But that sounds like it would take a massive amount of investment and coordination.
It would, but again, you have to weigh that against the cost of inaction on climate change. Investing in a truly sustainable energy system is an investment in our future, and I think that's something worth fighting for.
Well said. It sounds like Sweden's at a crossroads, facing some really tough choices about how to balance its energy needs with its commitment to a cleaner future.
They are. And the decisions they make today are going to have a big impact, not just for Sweden, but potentially for the whole world. What they learn and achieve could provide a roadmap for other countries that are trying to navigate the same complex energy transition.
So it's a story worth following closely, that's for sure. It's pretty amazing to think about, right? We might actually be getting a glimpse of what the future holds for other countries as they start to really embrace renewable energy.
Yeah, definitely. Sweden's kind of at the forefront of this whole transition, and I think there are a lot of valuable lessons we can learn from their experience, both the good and the bad.
We've talked about a lot today, everything from the potential downsides of too much wind and solar to the potential solutions like grid modernization and energy storage. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you see as the most important factor in Sweden's success so far?
That's a good question. I think if I had to choose one, it would be their commitment to taking a holistic approach. They're not just trying to, slap some more wind turbines and solar panels up and call it a day. They're really thinking about the entire energy system, how all the pieces fit together.
So it's like this giant jigsaw puzzle, right? You have to figure out how to make all the pieces work together, not just force them in.
Exactly. And it requires a lot of collaboration, too. You've got to have the government agencies, the energy providers, the researchers, and even just regular citizens all working together.
That brings up a good point, actually. What about public perception of all this? Are Swedish citizens generally on board with these changes? Are they willing to, adapt their energy use, maybe even pay a little more for cleaner energy.
That's a really crucial aspect of any kind of major energy transition. And from what I've seen, there's a pretty high level of awareness and support for renewable energy in Sweden.
Hmm.
Of course, there are always going to be some concerns about costs and, potential disruptions. But overall, there seems to be a strong sense of shared responsibility for tackling climate change.
So it's not just a technological challenge, it's a social one as well.
Absolutely. And that's why communication is so important. Policymakers and energy providers need to be really transparent about the benefits and challenges of the transition, and they need to make sure that citizens feel like they're part of the process.
It reminds me of what you were saying earlier about demand-side management, empowering individuals to be part of the solution. That seems like a really smart way to build support and get people invested in the outcome.
For sure. When people feel like they have a stake in something, they're much more likely to embrace it, even if it means making some changes in their own lives.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today in our deep dive into Sweden's Energy Balancing Act. It's clear that they're facing some pretty significant challenges as they try to ramp up their renewable energy production.
Challenges, yes, but also some amazing opportunities. Don't forget, Sweden has a long history of innovation, especially when it comes to environmental issues. They've set some really ambitious goals for themselves, and they're not afraid to take on the tough problems.
So for our listeners out there who might be feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information, what's the one thing they should take away from our conversation today? What's the big question they should be pondering as they go about their day?
Here's a thought. If Sweden succeeds in this balancing act, and I really believe they can, what lessons can they teach the rest of the world? How can their experience help pave the way for a global shift towards a more sustainable energy future? That's something worth thinking about.
It definitely is. Thanks for walking us through this fascinating and, dare I say, electrifying topic.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
And to our listeners, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.